It's been nearly 5 years since the release of Final Fantasy X, the last real Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy XII, its controversial and long-delayed successor, is finally here. But does it manage to deliver upon its potential? Final Fantasy XII is the story of Dalmasca, an occupied nation caught between two warring empires. Vaughn, a restless teen, gets caught up in the Dalmascan resistance and its fight against the Arcadian Empire, whose leader, Vayne, is using powerful nethicite as a weapon to win the war. Vaughn and his ragtag team of do-gooders set out to stop Vayne and the war so that Dalmasca isn't destroyed in the crossfire. The story here is more about nations and events than people, so while it makes sense that Final Fantasy XII's characters are underdeveloped, it doesn't stop it from being unsatisfying. Many of the story's other characters are more interesting than the ones you'll actually control, as your character's motivations are thin to non-existent. For example, despite being the main character, Vaughn is apparently just along for the ride.
Vaughn, if you ever want to see your home again, you'll do exactly as I say. Myself, Fran, and you, we're working together now. Understood?
While this results in fewer cutscenes overall, the game lacks the memorable emotional core of recent entries in the series. Despite the elaborate setup and some interesting ideas and themes, the story is surprisingly straightforward and ultimately unsatisfying. The extensive, exquisitely translated dialogue delays this realization until the end, and there's an awful lot of talk of politics and planning, but it's mostly backdrop and rarely affects you or your actions. Details of Final Fantasy XII's gameplay has stirred controversy for some time. Moving into a seamless world with real-time, non-random battles required a number of ambitious changes to the tradition-heavy series formula, all of which work well on paper. Ivalice is a massive world, whose landmass is rightfully compared to that of a massively multiplayer game. Traversing this huge, varied environment is often time-consuming and dangerous, as it's easy to wander into monsters well beyond your current fighting ability. This open-endedness is a welcome development for the series and really makes you feel like you're exploring the world. As you explore an adventure, you'll kill untold hordes of monsters, more than perhaps in any Final Fantasy game before it. Battles take place in the world without any kind of transition, making them a much more fluid experience than before. To make the number of battles more manageable, the developers created the controversial Gambit system. Gambits are instructions that tell your characters how to respond to various circumstances, essentially letting you program them to act on their own. While totally optional, most everyone will want to use them to automate time-sensitive and mundane tasks, such as healing characters in a pinch. You can always override gambits, and will often need to, as the gambit concepts are generally too broad to cover every situation, and small logical gaps in your instructions tend to spiral into major problems if left alone in harder battles. Gambit concepts are gradually introduced as you go through the game, but the developers were a tad too conservative, delaying a number of the more obviously useful ones until the end of the game. That said, the Gambit system is a solid addition and hardly merits its premature notoriety. As you lay waste to the fauna of Ivalice, you'll accumulate license points, which are used to buy licenses to develop your characters. Like a simple board game, the license board is used to learn spells and abilities and equip specific weapons and armor. Every character can use every piece of equipment and spell, provided it's been unlocked for them on the license board, making it the most flexible character customization system in a Final Fantasy game yet. At the edges of the license board are special mist abilities, allowing characters to expend great sums of mana to execute quickening attacks or the series' trademark summons. Quickenings are similar to the series' various super move abilities, and can be chained together by all your characters to inflict massive amounts of damage. However, because of both abilities' high mana costs, they also compete directly with healing and other spellcasting, making them something that should be conserved for emergencies or bosses. Of course, the game looks and sounds great. While the graphics and art direction are excellent, there isn't much here that hasn't been seen before. More noteworthy is the sound. The excellent writing is coupled with an excellent voice cast, and composer Hitoshi Sakamoto's fluid, movie-like score fits the game well while retaining the series' melodic flourishes. While many of these systems worried fans, they're the least of the game's problems. Instead, the problem lies in the execution and balance of the game built on top of them, and all the innovative systems and exciting production values can't hide the fact that Final Fantasy XII just isn't very fun to play.
Believe what you want to, whatever it takes to make you happy.
While the battle and gambit systems are solid and functional, the game's balance favors unexciting, repetitive melee attacks, rendering offensive magic and summons, two Final Fantasy staples, nearly useless. While this reliance on melee attacks meshes well with the gambit system, it also diminishes the need for actual strategy and interaction. Quickenings are useful, but their steep mana cost is an overly limiting, fun-deflating trade-off. Healing magic and certain melee-enhancing licenses, on the other hand, are almost too useful, and you'll want to teach them to every character, ultimately making everybody feel too similar. What's the point of having a vast number of customization options if the game pushes you to make every character the same? While exploring Ivalice and finding new areas can be fun, the constant barrage of monsters loses its appeal quickly. Extensive extracurricular leveling is necessary to complete the game, not only for valuable experience points, but also money to update your equipment. While this sort of grinding can be expected in most RPGs, it's taken to ridiculous new extremes in Final Fantasy XII. The optional monster hunting side quests and additional content can add some much-needed purpose to this grind, but they still can't keep the inevitable feeling of tedium at bay.
Some things never change, do they?
Final Fantasy XII's gameplay isn't terrible by any means, but simply can't support a game of its length. What would have worked wonderfully as a 25-hour game has been inflated to around 60 by filling the gaps with more monsters and terrain to run through. The game's total length is almost doubled when you consider its optional content, but what good is extra playtime if the core game is lacking? Despite the massive size of its world and seemingly endless optional content, Final Fantasy XII feels like an unfinished, conflicted game. Square Enix's developers seem to have fallen into the same trap the game's waiting fans did. While the overall scope and ambition has gotten plenty of attention, the minute-to-minute play experience has been all but ignored. There are some genre-evolving ideas at play here, but the story's shortcomings, the unsatisfying game balance, and the over-reliance on level grinding prevent it from being as fun as other games in the genre, or as engaging as other entries in the series.